At 7:14 a.m. on a gray Monday morning in late October 1978, a middle-aged man stepped out of a narrow brick apartment building on the east side of Arlington, Virginia, carrying a folded newspaper under his arm and a plain brown lunch bag in his hand. The air was cool, heavy with the smell of damp leaves and exhaust from the steady stream of commuters heading toward Washington. He locked the door behind him, checked the knob twice out of habit, and began the familiar walk toward the bus stop on Columbia Pike. To anyone watching, there was nothing remarkable about him. Average height, thinning hair, an unremarkable coat bought years earlier at a department store now gone. He worked a government job that rarely drew attention, paid his taxes on time, and had lived in the same building for nearly a decade. What no one on the sidewalk could see was that inside his lunch bag, beneath a sandwich wrapped in wax paper and an apple with a bruise on one side, lay a thin envelope that would soon force one of the most secretive intelligence services on Earth to destroy its own secrets in panic. For the next 12 minutes, he followed the same route he took every weekday, past a closed laundromat, past a dry cleaner opening its metal shutters, past a row of parked cars beaded with condensation. He waited for the bus without looking at anyone else, eyes fixed on the timetable bolted to the shelter. When it arrived, he boarded, dropped exact change into the fare box, and took a seat near the middle, careful not to choose the same place 2 days in a row. The bus pulled away, merging into traffic headed toward the Pentagon and downtown Washington. By the time it crossed the river, the envelope in his lunch bag was already part of a chain of events that would ripple quietly through embassy basements, secure rooms, and file archives in Moscow, leaving behind empty safes and burned paper. This is the story of how a man who appeared painfully ordinary became one of the most disruptive forces inside the Soviet intelligence apparatus during the late Cold War. It is the story of a clerk who never carried a gun, never traveled under an alias, and never met his adversaries face to face, yet forced senior officers of the KGB to tear apart their own operations in fear of what he might have revealed next. It is a story about patience, routine, and the quiet mechanics of counterintelligence, where the most devastating blows are delivered not with explosions or arrests, but with paper, timing, and silence. Above all, it is a story about deception and consequence, about how the act of telling the truth to one side can destroy lives on the other, and how the Cold War was often decided far from borders or battlefields, in the narrow spaces between ordinary mornings and irreversible decisions. The man at the center of this story had not set out to become a spy. He had grown up in the Midwest, the son of a machinist and a school secretary, in a town where loyalty was measured in years of steady work, and neighbors knew one another by routine rather than confession. After college, he drifted toward Washington, not out of ambition, but because it was where the jobs were. He married young, divorced quietly, and learned to live alone without drama. By the mid-1970s, he worked as a low-level analyst support clerk in a federal office building, whose name rarely appeared in newspapers. His duties were procedural and dull, logging documents, moving folders, maintaining access lists. He was trusted precisely because nothing about him suggested risk. Those who worked with him later told investigators that he was punctual, restrained, and forgettable. He brought the same lunch most days. He did not linger in break rooms or share opinions about politics. He listened more than he spoke. In the evenings, he watched television at low volume and read paperbacks borrowed from the local library. There were no obvious vices, no sudden changes in spending, no unexplained trips. If he felt anger or disillusionment, he kept it hidden behind habits that were consistent enough to become invisible. The first crack in that invisibility came not from ideology, but from proximity. His job placed him near information that was not meant for him, and over time, he began to notice patterns in the way certain documents moved through the building. Names repeated, access stamps changed color. Files that were supposed to remain sealed reappeared weeks later with subtle alterations. None of it was dramatic, but it suggested a machinery at work that depended on people like him not asking questions. According to later accounts, it was during this period that he began keeping small notes at home, not about the contents of documents, but about their movement, dates, initials, unexplained delays. By 1977, those notes had turned into something more deliberate. He purchased a cheap shortwave radio and began listening at night, scanning frequencies not for music or news, but for patterns. On certain evenings, at certain times, he heard a woman's voice reading strings of numbers in a flat, emotionless tone. He did not understand them, but he recognized what they were. He also understood what it meant that they existed at all. The decision to act did not come all at once. It emerged through routine, the same way his days did. He tested himself by imagining what would happen if he did nothing, and then by imagining what would happen if he did something small. A letter, perhaps. No name, no return address. Just information that would mean nothing to anyone except the people trained to recognize its value. He spent weeks drafting and redrafting that first message, then tore it up and started again. When he finally mailed it, he did so from a different neighborhood, wearing gloves he threw away immediately after. The response came months later, disguised as coincidence. A classified ad in a newspaper. A phrase that matched the one he had been told to watch for, buried among dozens of others. From that moment forward, his life divided into two parallel tracks. One was unchanged, steady, ordinary. The other was invisible, measured in signals, timing, and restraint. By the fall of 1978, the lunch bag routine was no longer just habit. It was cover. The envelope he carried that morning did not contain secrets in the dramatic sense. There were no blueprints or codes written out in full. Instead, it contained confirmations, acknowledgments that certain assumptions held true, that certain names were placed exactly where the other side believed they were. In the world of counterintelligence, confirmation can be more dangerous than revelation. It tells an adversary not just what exists, but that their picture of reality is accurate. Unbeknownst to him, similar envelopes were already being analyzed in secure rooms thousands of miles away. Men in Moscow were beginning to argue over how such precise knowledge could exist. Internal memos grew sharper in tone. Audits were ordered. Officers who had spent careers building networks of informants and assets found themselves suddenly questioned, not by enemies, but by their own superiors. Safes were opened. Files were reviewed line by line. And in some cases, decisions were made that could not be reversed. At the bus stop that morning, the man adjusted his grip on the lunch bag as the vehicle slowed near his destination. He did not know which of his actions would eventually force the Soviets to burn their secrets, only that the machinery was now moving. When he stepped off the bus, and joined the flow of workers heading into federal buildings. His pace was unhurried. He disappeared into the crowd, carrying with him the quiet beginning of an unraveling that would take years to fully reveal itself. At 8:02 a.m., the man entered the office building where he had worked for nearly 9 years, passed through the security checkpoint with the same laminated badge he had used thousands of times before, and took the elevator to the 5th floor. The fluorescent lights hummed faintly above the corridor as he walked to his desk, nodded once to a colleague without stopping, and sat down to begin the quiet mechanics of another workday. To anyone observing from a distance, his movements showed no hesitation. He logged into his terminal, sorted the incoming folders, and marked the date in the corner of a ledger with the same careful handwriting he had practiced since his first week on the job. Inside the building, nothing suggested that a counterintelligence storm had already begun to form around him. What he did not know was that by this point, the material he had already passed across the invisible boundary between enemies had triggered a reaction inside the Soviet intelligence services that was both immediate and deeply unsettling. According to later declassified assessments, analysts in Moscow had initially treated the early disclosures as a fluke, an isolated compromise, perhaps the result of a single careless officer or a technical lapse. But as the confirmations accumulated, that explanation became impossible to sustain. The information did not merely expose individual assets. It revealed structure. It implied access. And most troubling of all, it demonstrated an understanding of internal Soviet intelligence logic that suggested the source was not guessing. Within weeks, a quiet directive circulated through KGB headquarters. Senior officers were instructed to review active operations connected to the United States and Western Europe, paying particular attention to cases that relied on long-term placement rather than short-term collection. The tone of the directive was measured, but the message beneath it was unmistakable. Someone, somewhere, was inside the walls. Back in Virginia, the man adjusted his habits with the same discipline that governed everything else in his life. He did not suddenly become paranoid or erratic. Instead, he narrowed his movements. He began varying the time he left his apartment by 5 to 7 minutes. He stopped using the same payphone twice in 1 week. When he shopped for groceries, he chose stores farther from his home, lingering just long enough to blend into the slow choreography of suburban errands. Each change was small enough to appear random, but together they formed a pattern of caution that only someone under instruction would have followed. Communication with his handlers was infrequent and deliberately unsatisfying. There were no conversations, no reassurances. Messages arrived as signals, and his replies were acknowledgments rather than explanations. On one occasion, he was instructed to leave a package inside a public library, hidden behind a row of outdated encyclopedias that no one had touched in years. He did so in the middle of a weekday afternoon, wearing the same coat he always wore, carrying nothing that could not be explained if questioned. The package contained no documents, only a list of file numbers and a brief notation indicating which of them had recently changed custodians. To the men reviewing those numbers overseas, the implications were staggering. By early 1979, Soviet stations abroad began receiving abrupt instructions to suspend activity. Meetings were cancelled without explanation. Dead drops went untouched. Agents who had spent years cultivating trust with Western contacts were ordered to break off communication and return to safe routines. Some were recalled entirely, their careers effectively ended by suspicion. Others remained in place but were stripped of purpose, left waiting for orders that never came. The phrase that began appearing in internal correspondence was stark and telling: burn and rebuild. Burning secrets did not always involve literal fire. In many cases, it meant destroying relationships, erasing years of work, and accepting that entire networks were compromised beyond recovery. Files were shredded, codes were abandoned, identities were quietly withdrawn from use. The process was methodical and, to those involved, humiliating. An intelligence service built on the illusion of control was being forced to admit, internally at least, that it no longer knew who could be trusted. None of this was visible in the man's daily life. He continued to arrive at work on time. He continued to file paperwork, attend routine briefings, and return home in the evenings to a quiet apartment where the radio murmured softly in the background. On weekends, he washed his clothes at the same laundromat and bought the same brand of coffee. If he felt the weight of what he had set in motion, he carried it without outward sign. There were moments, however, when the strain surfaced in small ways. According to later interviews, neighbors recalled that he began checking his mailbox twice, once in the morning and once at night. A co-worker remembered that he started writing reminders to himself for tasks he had performed for years without prompts. These were not dramatic changes. They were the kinds of adjustments that occur when someone is living with an unspoken clock. Inside American counterintelligence circles, awareness of his existence was still limited. The information he provided was being compartmentalized, filtered through analysts who understood its value, but not its source. Even within the agencies benefiting from it, few people knew that the disruptions appearing in Soviet behavior were being driven by a single ordinary man who rode a bus to work each morning. That would not last. Patterns, once created, tend to attract attention. By mid-1979, Western analysts began noticing that Soviet intelligence activity had shifted abruptly in multiple theaters at once. Assets went dark. Communications changed frequency. Operations that had shown patience for decades suddenly collapsed. For seasoned observers, this kind of synchronized withdrawal could only mean one thing. The adversary believed itself compromised at a fundamental level. Behind closed doors, questions began to circulate. How had this happened? And who exactly was responsible? The man did not hear those questions, but he sensed their approach. One evening, as he stood at the window of his apartment, watching headlights trace slow lines along the street below, he reached out and closed the blinds earlier than usual. It was a small gesture, barely conscious, yet it reflected a growing understanding that the space between his ordinary life and the secret one was narrowing, and that the machinery he had set in motion was no longer moving quietly. By the summer of 1980, the quiet disruptions inside Soviet intelligence had become impossible to ignore. What had begun as cautious internal reviews hardened into something more severe. According to records later reconstructed from defectors' testimony and partial archives, senior officials in Moscow concluded that the problem was not limited to a single breach. The pattern suggested a sustained leak with access to internal decision-making, a source who understood not just names and locations, but priorities. The response shifted accordingly. Counterintelligence units were empowered to act with unusual latitude. Officers were ordered to scrutinize their own colleagues. Careers stalled overnight. Long-standing professional relationships dissolved under suspicion. This internal pressure manifested abroad in ways that Western services could observe, but not yet explain. Soviet diplomats curtailed travel without warning. Cultural attachés who had been fixtures at receptions and conferences disappeared from public view. In some cities, entire embassy sections seemed to shut down, their lights off long after normal working hours had ended. To American analysts, the behavior suggested panic masked as discipline. The man in Arlington was not informed of these developments directly. His contact with the people benefiting from his disclosures remained intentionally thin. Instructions arrived rarely, sometimes weeks apart, and were framed conservatively. Do not expand access. Do not attempt to obtain new categories of material. Continue only what you have already been doing. The message was clear. Consistency mattered more than ambition. At work, he adhered to that guidance with almost mechanical precision. He resisted the temptation to look for anything outside his normal scope, even when curiosity tugged at him. He focused instead on the flow of information he was already positioned to observe. When a familiar file stopped appearing, he noted its absence. When an access list was updated, he memorized the changes rather than writing them down. The discipline required was exhausting, but it kept him safe. What he could not control was the growing interest of his own government in the effects he was producing. By early 1981, a small group of American counterintelligence officers had begun comparing notes across agencies. They did not know the source's identity, but they understood the magnitude of the damage being inflicted on their adversary. Soviet tradecraft had grown erratic. Methods that had once been textbook suddenly showed signs of overcorrection. Dead drops were abandoned prematurely. Surveillance teams appeared where none had been before, then vanished. In several cases, Western services received indications that Soviet assets had been recalled or cut loose abruptly, sometimes with devastating consequences for the individuals involved. One internal memorandum, circulated among senior officials, posed a question that would shape the next phase of events. If the source was this good, how long could he remain undiscovered? The answer depended not only on his discipline, but on chance. That chance arrived in the form of a minor administrative review. In April 1981, the office where he worked underwent a routine audit, the kind that occurred every few years and rarely produced more than mild inconvenience. Access logs were checked against job descriptions. Clearance levels were revalidated. Supervisors were asked to account for any irregularities, however small. For most employees, the process was forgettable. For him, it was unsettling. He noticed the auditor's questions lingering just a little longer at his desk. He noticed a request for clarification about a task he had performed dozens of times without comment. None of it amounted to an accusation, but it reminded him that invisibility was never permanent. That evening, he returned home and removed a small notebook from its hiding place, flipping through pages filled with shorthand symbols and dates. He stared at them for a long time before deciding to destroy it. The next morning, the notebook no longer existed. Across the Atlantic, the pressure inside Soviet intelligence reached a breaking point. In a secure facility outside Moscow, senior officers convened to review the damage. The conclusion was grim. Whatever the source's identity, he had forced them into a reactive posture that compromised not only current operations, but institutional confidence. Trust, always fragile, had eroded to the point where effective coordination was becoming impossible. The only way forward, they concluded, was radical purification. Orders went out to terminate entire lines of operation. Some assets were informed obliquely that their services were no longer required. Others received no explanation at all. In a few cases, officers suspected of negligence or worse were quietly reassigned, their careers ending without formal charges. Paper was destroyed in bulk. Codes were rendered obsolete overnight. The burn was real, and it was extensive. The irony, later noted by historians, was that these actions confirmed the accuracy of what the man had already provided. Each overreaction validated his assessments. Each internal purge reinforced the sense, on the Western side, that the source was not exaggerating. In Arlington, his own sense of time grew distorted. Days felt longer, nights shorter. He began waking before his alarm, listening to the sounds of the building settling around him. He checked his door lock more than once before leaving, not out of fear of arrest, but out of a generalized need for control. He avoided social contact where he could, not because he suspected anyone in particular, but because unpredictability itself felt dangerous. In June 1981, he received a signal instructing him to pause all activity for an indefinite period. No explanation accompanied it. For the first time since his involvement had begun, he was told to do nothing. The pause was, in many ways, harder than the work. Without tasks to focus on, he found himself replaying past actions, wondering which detail might eventually unravel him. He imagined investigators reconstructing his routines, noticing the slight variations he had introduced. He imagined questions asked and answered without his knowledge. Yet weeks passed, then months, and nothing happened. What he did not know was that the pause reflected a debate on the other side of the exchange. American officials were weighing the risks of continued exploitation against the possibility that the source might already be under suspicion. Some argued that the damage done was sufficient, that pushing further risked losing an asset whose value lay precisely in his continued anonymity. Others believed that the upheaval inside Soviet intelligence represented a unique opportunity to learn how an adversary responded to existential threat. In the end, the decision was made cautiously. The source would remain dormant, observed but not tasked, while analysts studied the aftershocks of his earlier contributions. Those aftershocks continued to spread. By the end of 1981, Western intelligence assessments concluded that Soviet operations in several key regions had been set back by years. Networks painstakingly assembled since the early 1970s were gone. Training pipelines were disrupted. The institutional memory that underpinned long-term strategy had been fractured. All of it traced back, in ways few could yet articulate, to a man who still boarded the same bus each morning, carrying the same lunch bag, blending into a crowd that had no idea how close it was to the hidden fault lines of the Cold War. The lull did not mean safety. In the world he had entered, silence was often a prelude rather than a reprieve. By early 1982, subtle indicators suggested that the balance he had relied on was beginning to shift. Soviet intelligence activity, though reduced, had not disappeared. Instead, it had grown more careful, more inward-looking. Where there had once been confidence, there was now scrutiny. Where there had once been initiative, there was delay. To American analysts, this looked less like collapse and more like adaptation. That adaptation carried risks. Inside U.S. counterintelligence, concern grew that the very scale of disruption caused by the source might eventually point back toward him. An adversary stripped of options tends to focus on fundamentals: who has access, who benefits from routine, who has been overlooked. The safer the source appeared, the more dangerous that assumption became. In March 1982, he received his first instruction in nearly a year. It was brief, cautious, and narrower than anything he had been asked to do before. He was not told to collect new information. He was told to confirm a single fact: whether a specific internal review committee still existed, and if so, whether its membership had changed. The request reflected a deeper concern on the American side. Analysts believed the Soviets might be attempting to rebuild compromised structures under new administrative shells. Knowing whether those shells were real mattered. He complied without deviation. Over several weeks, he observed quietly, relying on the same skills that had carried him this far: memory, patience, and restraint. When he sent his confirmation, it contained fewer than 20 words. It was enough. The response was immediate and unsettling. Within months, Western services observed another wave of Soviet internal retrenchment. The committee in question was dissolved. Its files vanished from circulation. In at least one foreign station, personnel associated with it were recalled abruptly. To those watching from the outside, it was clear that the Soviets had again chosen destruction over uncertainty. This time, however, the consequences were more visible. By late 1982, reports began to surface of Soviet assets being arrested in Eastern Europe, and even within the Soviet Union itself. Officially, these were framed as routine counterintelligence successes or internal security matters. Unofficially, they signaled a system eating its own. Officers once trusted to manage sensitive operations were now suspected of compromise. Some disappeared into reassignment, others vanished entirely. Historians would later note that this period marked a profound psychological break within Soviet intelligence. The fear was no longer external, it was internal, corrosive, and self-sustaining. And it had been triggered, in part, by information that was never meant to cause such damage, but inevitably did. For the man in Arlington, the effects were indirect, but palpable. He sensed that the stakes had risen again. He returned to small precautions he had abandoned during the pause. He changed routes. He limited errands. He stopped using his shortwave radio altogether, dismantling it one evening and discarding the pieces in different trash bins over several weeks. When he walked, he paid closer attention to reflections in store windows, not because he saw anything suspicious, but because not looking felt reckless. At work, the atmosphere subtly changed. Security briefings grew more frequent. Posters reminding employees of reporting obligations appeared in hallways. Colleagues spoke less freely, even about harmless topics. One afternoon, he was asked to attend a routine interview as part of a broader security refresher. The questions were generic, the tone professional. Still, as he answered them, he noticed his own hands resting flat against his thighs, fingers pressed together to keep them steady. The interview ended without incident. He returned to his desk and resumed his work. No one followed him home. No one knocked on his door that night. Yet the encounter lingered in his mind, not as a threat, but as a reminder that systems designed to detect betrayal do not need certainty to act. They need suspicion. Across the ocean, the Soviet response reached its most extreme expression yet. According to later testimony, senior intelligence officials authorized a comprehensive purge of long-term operations associated with the United States. This was not a targeted cleanup. It was a scorched earth strategy. If an operation could not be proven safe beyond doubt, it was terminated. If an officer's career intersected too often with compromised structures, it was stalled or ended. In some cases, years of careful work vanished overnight. Agents who had lived double lives for decades found themselves suddenly isolated, cut off from handlers who no longer trusted the ground beneath their feet. Some attempted to re-establish contact on their own. Those attempts were interpreted as further evidence of compromise. The man never learned how many lives were upended as a result of his actions. He knew only that the confirmations he provided continued to produce outsized reactions. The realization weighed on him, not as guilt in the conventional sense, but as a growing awareness of scale. He was no longer a participant in a quiet exchange. He was a catalyst. By the end of 1982, American officials faced a difficult choice. The source had exceeded every expectation. He had destabilized an adversary's intelligence apparatus without ever leaving his routine life. But the longer he remained active, the greater the risk that his very success would expose him. Some argued that it was time to extract him, to remove him from the environment that made his work possible, but also deadly. Others warned that extraction itself could draw attention, creating exactly the kind of anomaly the Soviets were trained to notice. The debate remained unresolved as winter set in. On a cold evening in December, the man stood in his kitchen, waiting for water to boil. The apartment was quiet, except for the low hum of the refrigerator. Outside, snow fell lightly, muting the sounds of traffic. He watched steam rise from the pot and thought briefly about how little of his life had changed on the surface. The same job, the same building, the same routines. What had changed was invisible and irreversible. By the beginning of 1983, the question was no longer whether the man could continue, but whether continuing served any purpose beyond temptation. Inside American intelligence, the assessment had grown sober. The damage inflicted on Soviet operations was now measurable, not just in disrupted networks, but in altered behavior. Analysts noted that Moscow's foreign intelligence arm had become slower, more conservative, and internally fragmented. Decisions that once took days now took months. Opportunities were missed. Initiative had been replaced by caution. From a counterintelligence perspective, this was success. From an operational perspective, it was dangerous. The man himself was not consulted in these debates. He remained what he had always been, a source, not a partner. Yet the effects of the internal discussion reached him indirectly. Instructions stopped arriving. Signals went unanswered. The silence stretched beyond anything he had experienced before. Weeks passed with no guidance at all. For someone whose survival depended on structure, the absence of structure became its own threat. He continued going to work, continued shopping for groceries, continued riding the bus, but the sense of purpose that had once organized his caution was gone. Without it, he found himself replaying old decisions, searching for errors that might not exist. He wondered whether his earlier confirmations had gone too far, whether the magnitude of Soviet reaction had accelerated scrutiny on the wrong side of the equation. He did not know if the people who had once guided him were protecting him, or had simply decided that the risk now outweighed his value. That uncertainty coincided with a change in his environment. In February 1983, the building where he worked implemented a new security protocol. It was framed as an update, routine and preventative, but it altered access patterns that had remained stable for years. Certain files were relocated. Oversight responsibilities shifted. The effect was subtle but unmistakable. Layers were being added, and with them, new points of friction. For the first time, he found himself needing to justify actions that had once passed without comment. One afternoon, he was asked to explain why he had accessed a particular registry weeks earlier. The explanation was simple and true. It was accepted without dispute. Still, the interaction unsettled him. It suggested not accusation, but curiosity. And curiosity in security systems is often the first step toward something else. Around the same time, Western intelligence began detecting signs that the Soviets were attempting to reconstruct fragments of what they had destroyed. New structures appeared under different names. Personnel shuffled into unfamiliar roles. The effort was tentative, cautious, and deeply mistrustful of itself. Analysts believed Moscow was testing the ground, probing for leaks without committing fully to renewed operations. This presented an opportunity and a risk. Some argued that one final confirmation from the source could reveal whether the reconstruction was genuine or merely cosmetic. Others countered that asking anything further of him was irresponsible. The source had already forced an adversary to burn decades of work. Pushing again might invite disaster. The disagreement culminated in a single, tightly controlled request. In late March 1983, he received a signal instructing him to verify one last detail: whether a newly established internal unit had inherited the functions of those previously dismantled. It was the smallest task he had been given in years. It was also the most dangerous. The Soviets, analysts believed, were watching their own shadows. Any confirmation that the new unit mattered could provoke another purge, or expose the existence of someone who should not know such things. He considered refusing, not openly, but by delaying, by letting the opportunity pass. In the end, routine won. Routine had always been his shield. He observed, memorized, and reported with the same economy of detail he had practiced from the beginning. The effect was immediate. Within weeks, Soviet behavior shifted again. The new unit vanished almost as soon as it had appeared. Personnel were reassigned. Paper trails ended abruptly. To Western observers, it was unmistakable. Moscow had concluded that whatever it built could not remain hidden. This time, however, the reaction carried a new tone. It was no longer panic. It was resignation. Defectors would later describe this period as one of institutional exhaustion. The belief that secrecy could be restored through destruction had been tested and found wanting. Burning secrets had not eliminated the problem. It had only deepened mistrust and hollowed out capability. In trying to protect itself, the system had consumed its own foundations. For the man, the aftermath was quiet and final. In April 1983, he received a message instructing him to cease all activity permanently. There was no explanation, no expression of gratitude, no acknowledgement of what he had accomplished. The instruction was clear and absolute. He was to return to being exactly what he appeared to be. He complied without hesitation. He destroyed what little remained of his clandestine routines. He stopped watching for signals. He stopped counting steps and minutes. He allowed himself to leave the apartment at the same time every day again. The relief was real, but it was tempered by something else. The knowledge that disengagement did not erase memory. He could stop acting, but he could not stop knowing. Inside Soviet intelligence, the consequences continued to unfold. By mid-1983, entire operational doctrines had been revised. Recruitment slowed. Trust was rationed. The belief in long-term penetration, once a cornerstone of Soviet tradecraft, had been shaken. The damage was not just operational. It was philosophical. None of this was public. There were no announcements, no trials that explained what had happened. The Cold War moved on, outwardly unchanged. But beneath the surface, something fundamental had shifted. It had shifted because one man, living an ordinary life, had proven that secrecy could be undone, not by brilliance or force, but by access, patience, and restraint. And because of that, the final reckoning had not yet arrived. The reckoning came not with sirens or arrests, but with time. In the months after he ceased all activity, nothing happened. No one approached him. No investigation surfaced. The world he had quietly destabilized appeared to close around him again, sealing itself as if it had never opened. He continued to work in the same building, at the same desk, performing the same procedural tasks. When colleagues retired or transferred, their replacements never questioned the routines he followed. The systems around him absorbed his stillness without protest. To the outside world, he had simply aged. Inside American intelligence, his case was gradually downgraded from active to dormant, then to historical. Analysts continued to study the effects of what he had done, but his name, never widely known even within classified circles, appeared less frequently in briefings. The focus shifted to new crises, new technologies, new adversaries. The Cold War, as it always had, demanded constant attention elsewhere. Yet the legacy of his actions lingered in ways that were difficult to quantify. Throughout the mid-1980s, Western intelligence assessments consistently noted a decline in Soviet human intelligence effectiveness in key regions. Operations that once demonstrated patience and depth now showed hesitation. Recruitment suffered. Long-term placements were viewed with skepticism inside Moscow, their value questioned in a system that had learned, painfully, how vulnerable time itself could be. Younger officers were trained with a caution that bordered on paralysis. The fear was no longer that the enemy might be watching. It was that the enemy might already know. Former Soviet intelligence officers who later spoke after the system they served collapsed described this period in stark terms. They did not always know the details. Few understood exactly how the damage had begun. What they remembered was the atmosphere, the sudden reversals, the destruction of files without explanation, the sense that something fundamental had been breached and could not be repaired. Burning secrets, they admitted, had not restored control. It had only erased certainty. The man at the center of it all never received confirmation of any of this. No one told him how many operations had been terminated, how many careers ended, how many lives were permanently altered. He learned only what any attentive citizen could infer from newspapers and television, that the Soviet Union appeared increasingly cautious, increasingly brittle. that its intelligence failures were becoming harder to hide, that the confidence it once projected was thinning. In his personal life, the consequences were quieter but enduring. He never married again. He maintained friendships at a careful distance, not out of fear, but habit. Decades of restraint do not dissolve easily. He remained vigilant in small, unnecessary ways, checking doors that did not need checking, noticing details that no longer mattered. These habits no longer protected anything. They simply remained. When the Cold War ended, there was no moment of closure for him. The fall of the Berlin Wall, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the public revelations of espionage scandals, all of it unfolded on television screens like someone else's story. The role he had played was not mentioned. There were no acknowledgments, no medals, no reckoning that tied cause to effect. That, in its own way, was fitting. The kind of intelligence work he had performed was never meant to be celebrated. Its success depended on remaining unseen, its failures absorbed into larger narratives. He had not changed history with a single dramatic act. He had changed it incrementally, by forcing an adversary to doubt itself so deeply that it destroyed what it could no longer trust. In the end, that was how one man made the Soviets burn their secrets, not through violence or brilliance, but through proximity, not by stealing documents, but by confirming truths, not by shouting, but by remaining silent when silence mattered most. He lived out his remaining years as he had always lived them, ordinary, unremarkable, largely forgotten. The Cold War moved on, then passed into history. What remained was a lesson recorded quietly in declassified files and fractured memories, that even the most secretive systems can be undone by those they least expect, and that the greatest damage is sometimes inflicted not by what is taken, but by what is revealed to be known.